Hi, we're going to go through First Amendment issues. Um, in some of your books, it's chapter 15. In other books, it's a different chapter. So don't worry if it doesn't completely match up. Okay, you ready? All right, there are a couple things that we're going to talk about in this unit that are actually not covered by the First Amendment. When we say something doesn't enjoy First Amendment protection, that means it's essentially illegal. One of those things is libel. Libel is very, very common online. What it is a lie that's been published through the media. Okay, don't be confused with the word published thinking that it's only in books or paper. It's a lie that's been published through the media that causes someone substantial harm, either professional or financial harm. Okay, now libel is so common online, obviously, because it's so easy to do. We can all anonymously libel each other all the time. If you rant about your ex-girlfriend online and call her all such horrible names and keeps her from getting future jobs, she can sue you for libel. It doesn't mean that she'll necessarily win the case. But if everything you wrote about your ex-girlfriend is the truth, you're protected. The truth will always protect you in a libel case. Okay? Can you rant about teachers? Absolutely. People do it all the time. Now, say for example that someone got on ratemyprofessor.com and said, Julie Smith said blah 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 in class today. And if I was applying for a job at another school and they checked that, and that kept me from getting that job, I could sue for libel if I could prove that I never actually said that in class. If I did say what was accused of me in class, then I have no case because it's the truth. That's what you have to remember about libel and slander. They have to be lies. If they're true, it's not libel and it's not slander. Slander is spoken, libel is published in the media. Okay? The difficult part, again, like say somebody lied about me on Rate My Professor, how do I know who it is? Anybody can get online and create a profile, right? So there's a lot of libelous activity that takes place online that's unenforceable. Now, this is a really interesting case, and it happened here in St. Louis. A guy took his car to Jim Butler Chevrolet in Fenton and set up a dashboard camera. Okay. So according to his camera, the mechanics worked on his car for 90 minutes. He was charged for 6 hours of service. So he basically took this tape to the service department and said, can you explain this? Because according to my camera, your mechanics were only working on my car for 90 minutes, and yet I get billed for 6 hours of service. And they did not buckle down. So he put this on YouTube. It's like a condensed tape of the mechanics on his car talking about how they were going to make a lot of money off his car. Okay. Now, Jim Butler sues him for libel, right? But what does he have on his side? They also demanded that he take the video down. So we'll talk about this more in class, but I think this is a really interesting case, and it's an example of how libel and slander are everywhere. There was a survey that came out last year that acknowledged that some people think that musicians shouldn't be allowed to sing offensive lyrics or lyrics that other people might find offensive. Now remember, the First Amendment does not protect us from jerks. The First Amendment does not protect us from getting our feelings hurt. That's not the point of the First Amendment. When we use the word offensive, it's so subjective because what's offensive to me might not be offensive to anybody else. And once you start outlawing things based on their offensiveness, you're going down a very, very, very slippery slope. All right. Can you get yourself in legal trouble on Facebook and Twitter? Absolutely, you can. There was a teacher. What district was she from? Oh, I'm going to have to find it. I'll have it in class. She tweeted something Friday about Ferguson and used a lot of racial terms. And she was put on a leave without pay while they tried to figure out what to do because, she should have known that whatever she puts on social media is for the whole world to see. People know she's a teacher and she had signed a contract based on, her professional behavior. So, yeah, you can get yourself in legal trouble. Something for you to consider at SIU, especially because it's a state school, if you use school resources to publish anything online, you might not be as protected by the First Amendment if you would be if you were using private material, because the Illinois taxpayers have paid for the Wi-Fi system. The Illinois taxpayers have paid for the building that you're in. Sometimes maybe the Illinois taxpayers have paid for the computer that you're using if you're using one in the computer lab. So you have to be very careful because the levels of responsibility change depending on who may have paid for your equipment. We're going to talk about, we've already talked about this a little bit in class about what should be legal and illegal, but of course we're going to talk about the Megan Meyer case. You want to be familiar with that case. Here's the definition of cyber hate. And I want you to read, and we're going to read this in class and talk about it because it's pretty broad. Hate speech. Remember, and this is my opinion as a person. We can't make being a jerk illegal. So outlawing hate speech, I think, is problematic. There's lots of anti-Catholic stuff on Facebook. There's anti-everything stuff on Facebook. But is this legal, what these people are doing? I have to tell you a great story about Stormfront. There was a shooting at a mosque in Kansas City last semester. I don't know if you remember that. But the shooter was a member of this group called Stormfront. And I had never heard of it before. But my sons use a username on the Xbox called Stormfront 612 based on one of the Star Wars games. And 612 is the oldest birthday. So I saw that he was a member of this group called Stormfront, and I thought, oh my God. So I had the boys come up. I'm like, look, you got to change your Xbox name. Why? It costs $10. Why do we have to change your name? And I explained it to them, and they're like, oh my goodness. Yeah, so they wanted to change their name to something that was the least offensive they could think of, and I think it became something like interior furnishing 612 or something, just something completely out there. But you never know. You might choose a username that you think is really innocuous, but it could be associated with something else. So just be on your toes. And my kids are not white supremacists, obviously. That was crazy. All right. The thing to remember about the First Amendment is it was written in like the 1780s. And what the First Amendment was protecting at that point was Joe Schmo down at the corner with his printing press, writing things about the British government and our government. And that the First Amendment wanted him to have the ability to criticize the government without being punished. So now, fast forward to this year, and now the First Amendment has been stretched to cover so many more things, right? It's not just a printing press anymore. It's everything that we've talked about so far this semester. So it's very fluid, and it has to be flexible and stretched to cover all of the new forms of speech and press that we have now that we didn't have before. So what this chapter essentially is about whether or not media content affects us. And of course it does. Remember when we talked about like school shootings, obviously the first thing that people come up with was, well, did they play video games? It's almost the knee-jerk reaction, right? So there's a lot of criticisms of media effects research that it's not really all that valid. And remember, my take on it is, look, if we spend 11 and a half hours a day with something, which is the average, remember, how could it not affect us? How could it not? Now, the hard part with studying media effects is that you have to figure out what you're going to measure and what those effects are. How do you measure them? Because if I want to measure, well, let's see if media make kids violent. Aren't there 1,000 other variables that lead to a kid becoming violent other than what media they ingest? Right? So it's messy. And that's, I think, what makes it very interesting. So there are a few terms and theories that you're going to need to know from this particular chapter. You want to make sure you know the story about the pain studies. You want to make sure you understand the difference between the transmission and ritual perspective of media. Okay. You want to know the hypodermic needle model. Yeah, and do you notice that I'm not going over these really? Because I want you to come to class. The minimal effects model, I think, is actually my favorite, even though some people say it's kind of a cop-out, but I think it's right on target. Uses and gratifications is a really interesting theory that I think is true, that we use media to satisfy certain emotional or intellectual needs, right? But it doesn't talk about what the effects of those might be, which we'll talk about in class. Two-step flow, I think, sounds like a country song, but it's actually a pretty interesting theory held by many people, including MTV. We'll talk about that in class. Dissonance theory is very simple. It basically boils down to selective exposure, selective retention, and we've already talked about that too. Symbolic interaction is the advertising theory word for the association principle that we talked about in the advertising unit. You attach a flag to anything, suddenly we're going to like it more, right? So we use symbolic interactions with lots of products, product positioning, association principle, same thing. Remember, you need to use the scientific method if you're doing effects research. It means it needs to be objective, reliable, and valid. You've probably already covered this kind of stuff. Are surveys valid? No. Let's do that one more time. Are surveys valid? No. No. Never believe a poll. When you hear something about a poll in the news, your little internal bullshit detector should go off and say, who sponsored the poll and who wrote the questions and who did they ask, because it's all very easily manipulated. Content analysis is when you actually measure things within the media production. So you can say, you know what, I'm going to measure the sexual content of an episode of How I Met Your Mother. Well, what does that mean exactly? Because you don't actually see people have sex on that show, but it's a recurring theme of the show. So how are you going to define it? How are you going to define violence within a show? As long as you define it well, that's fine, but you have to be really careful. Content analysis will end up with data, which is great, but you have to be careful about your pool. And you just have to define everything that you measure. We're going to learn about the social learning theory this time. If you haven't heard about it yet, it's important. Do we imitate what we see? Of course we do. Agenda setting's big, cultivation theory is big. Spiralist silence was recently in the news, especially all over Twitter. It's very important stuff. Yeah, I went through it really fast because I want you to come to class. So this will help you maybe review a little bit. Huh? Okay, let me know if you have any questions. See ya.